They told me I couldn't bring my cats with me, so you just get me and some fabulous panelists. And just because I listened to myself talk quite enough, I thought we'd go around the horn and let our panelists introduce themselves before we get into it. So, to my immediate left, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Sean McQuaw. I'm the Director General of Cyber Operations at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is Canada's intelligence agency. You'll notice on all the material for this, it's just Sean M, because that's just how we roll.
My name is Tanya O'Callaghan. I'm the Vice President of Community Investment Policy and Advocacy at CIRA, the .ca domain name registry. So in my purview at CIRA, I oversee basically everything that makes us give back to the internet community in Canada.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Smith. I'm with the cybersecurity company Portage, headquartered right here in the NCR. I just want to say first, thanks for inviting me to speak at this event, participate in this event today. Really happy to be here. I saw a tweet go out yesterday introducing me as the Executive Vice President of Business Interrogations. I thought, wow, what a cool job title that is. If only that were true. I have a much less cool job title. I'm the EVP of Business Integrations, but my job does give me the opportunity to travel coast to coast, meeting with local public sector technology leaders, a lot in local government, municipalities, healthcare space. Looking forward to sharing a little bit of what I learned while on the road with you today. So thanks for having me here.
Thanks, Chris, and we'll see if we can get in a souvenir interrogation for you before the day's out.
We can do that.
We were joking before the panel that we always have the fun panel because we have the most frightening subject matter, and that tends to get us sort of grip credibility that we may or may not deserve. But we're going to go with that anyway. And just to level set, to talk about cyber threats, I'm going to introduce some of the key, as they call them, key judgments set out in the recent Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity's National Cyber Threat Assessment 2023-24. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this is building on and reaffirming a lot of the conclusions and wisdom set out in CSIS's own 2020 report. So I would commend both of those to you. So here's what we're looking at for 2023-24. It's more of the same, basically, spoilers, but we'll get into it in a bit of detail. One, ransomware is a persistent threat to Canadian organizations, or remains so. It's the threat that's most likely to affect Canadians and Canadian organizations. Second, critical infrastructure is increasingly at risk from cyber threat activity. We're seeing, or we expect to see, state-sponsored actors targeting critical infrastructure. And we know we're already seeing state-sponsored cyber actors probably refraining from going after Canadian infrastructure in the absence of direct hostilities, but we are seeing state-sponsored threat activity against individual Canadians. And here we have the examples of dissidents abroad who are here in Canada and are being attacked by foreign governments who don't like what they have to say. We're seeing cyber threat actors attempting to influence Canadians, degrading trust in online spaces, and we expect to see this accelerate with machine learning enabled technologies, making fake content and deepfakes easier to manufacture and harder to detect. We expect, as a community, I guess we could say, we expect that Canadians' exposure to these technologies and the risks that they pose are going to increase over the next 2 years. We're also worried about disruptive technologies bringing new opportunities and new threats. And technologies such as cryptocurrency and decentralized finance are both proving to be juicy targets for cyber threat actors to enable malicious threat activity. And we're not even going to get into in this panel what quantum computing might bring, other than to say in short that it's going to threaten our own ability to maintain trust and confidentiality online, because it's going to take encryption down with it potentially. So, with all that good news out of the way, we're here to talk about sort of cyber threats, in particular to the MUSH sector. Now, we hear a lot about attacks on big targets. These are what make the news. Often they're corporate targets, big brands that we all know. Also the ones that are best equipped to sustain and bounce back from an attack. But what we are also seeing a lot of in the last few years are attacks on what we're going to refer to in this panel as the MUSH sector: municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals. And these are organizations that, generally speaking, are less well equipped to defend against all this. I'm going to start with you, Tanya. What's the current cybersecurity landscape that organizations are navigating look like?
Sure. So we have a little bit of insight into this. CIRA annually surveys hundreds, but 500 small, medium organizations coast to coast and get their experiences, perspectives, a sense of their readiness when it comes to cybersecurity. So I've got some cheat sheet data here. So certainly one thing that became apparent over the last two surveys is that the pandemic has made the cybersecurity landscape more complex for small and medium organizations. Remote work is certainly one of those elements. In our last survey, about half of responding organizations say they feel more vulnerable from a cybersecurity standpoint because their employees are working remote at least part-time. In that last survey, we heard that 44% of organizations experienced attacks, either attempted or successful, in the last 12 months. I would venture to say that number is probably higher, and that's probably 44% who are aware that they have experienced an attack. Now, one interesting point, and we might touch on cybersecurity and its link to privacy through the conversation today, is that in that same survey this year, about 66%, two-thirds, said they store personal information of their customers, their employees, their suppliers, and so on. And then amongst those who had a breach in the last year, only half reported that breach to their senior leadership teams, a little over half to their senior leadership team, and a little under half to their boards of directors, or worse yet, their customers who may have been affected. But there is some good news. I think we've been pretty doom and gloom so far. First is that the vast majority of organizations, above 90%, have some form of cyber awareness training plan in place to help upskill their employees. About two-thirds of those say they do something quarterly, which is certainly progress over what we've seen in previous years. A little over 4 out of 5 organizations have cyber response plans. About 3/4 say part of that cyber response plan includes cyber insurance. And I know from pre-conversations that we've had here yesterday, we have lots of opinions about that. And certainly, one caveat to that cyber insurance being part of the plan is that it means that more than 3/4 of organizations that were hit by ransomware paid the ransom, or their insurance did. And the average payout is now netting out somewhere around $25,000. So that's just to paint the picture of some of what we're going to see today.
Thank you. Now, we're 2 years out from CSIS's own report on this, Sean, and I know CSIS has seen a lot since then. Anything you'd like to add to that picture?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very quickly evolving landscape, but I think it's important to remember, and when we go back to the MUSH sector, the type of information that you have and the type of information in your possession of your organization is somewhat determinant of the type of attacks you're going to face, right? And cyber attacks can kind of come through two main vectors, right? There's the state-sponsored cyber attack, really advanced technologies, APTs and stuff like that. I know the last panel wouldn't name names, but I'm happy to name names. Both the CSIS annual report and the CCCS's report specifically identify Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea as being the primary state actors that are responsible for cyber attacks against Canadian society, Canadian industry. So that's one vector, and then the other vector, of course, is ransomware and cyber criminals. And if you're producing a really unique, advanced piece of technology, and Canada does a lot of that, Canada's a world leader in a lot of different technologies, there's a possibility that you will come under the focus of a state actor that is really quite determined to steal that technology from you. For their own economic gain. That creates potentially higher bar for you in terms of your cyber defense. But again, if you're in the MUSH sector, or if you're retail, we talked about agriculture last time. If you're a farmer in Manitoba, or a fisher in Nova Scotia or something like that, or if you're just producing low technology goods, just Mark 1 wing nuts, your biggest threat is going to be from a ransomware actor. And I'm actually fairly optimistic. There's two ways of looking at ransomware, right? One is that it's going to happen to me and there's nothing I can do about it, or it'll never happen to me. I don't think either one is a particularly useful way of looking at the problem. I think that the better way to look at the problem is to say, crime exists, and cybercrime is a crime, and most crime is opportunistic. Cybercrime exists, it's going to happen to someone, it doesn't have to happen to me. And there are steps that I can take as a small and medium enterprise that will make the target, and not to pass the buck, but the buck is going, somebody is going to get mugged, and at the end of the day, as a small, medium enterprise or as a medium-sized country, I would prefer that crime does not affect Canada or Canadian enterprises.
So this takes us back to the story of the two hunters being chased by the bear, and the first says, I don't think I can run fast enough to avoid this bear, and the other one says, I just have to be able to outrun you.
Do you want to be eaten by a bear?
It's not exactly plan A. So Chris, your company services clients in that mush sector, which is a terrific focus, and I'm glad to see it for a cyber vendor. What are the challenges that your clients are facing in this realm?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brent. So, as I mentioned earlier, I get the opportunity to travel and meet our technology leaders coast to coast, speaking mostly with local government technology leaders, also though in the healthcare space, quite a bit, and our education leaders as well. And over the last couple of years, I've really heard two kind of changes in messaging, changes in tone, I think touching a little bit on what Sean just mentioned. The first is that technology leaders across the board, they used to say if our organization were to be a victim of a cyber attack, this is what our plan would be or what we would do. Now the message has become when our organization, and if we've been so fortunate as to not have gone through an attack, we are likely to be next. And so for our technology leaders, for our local governments and the organizations in the mush space, it's become a matter of inevitability. We are under attack and we need to be prepared for it. That's the first common thread. But the second message I'm hearing is largely that they feel that they don't have the resources, and that's not just money, but that's the skill set, the capabilities, the staff for this challenge that seems almost unsurmountable. I mean, we're talking about foreign countries, we're talking about domestic challenges, we're talking about all sorts of threats and attacks coming from all different directions. And when you're meeting with these technology leaders, in smaller municipalities, we're talking a technology leader who's the sole actor responsible for everything from networking to desktops and your kind of laptops that you work on, responsible for fixing the mayor's cell phone when it stops working on a Friday. And then, oh, by the way, cybersecurity and protecting the entire institution somewhere on the corner of their desk. And so they do feel, a lot of these smaller organizations, that they need more support. And they are getting creative. We're going to talk about the ways that they're solving this problem in a few minutes. But it is a big challenge, and it's a challenge that I'm hearing, it doesn't matter where we are in Canada or even across North America, everyone is saying the exact same thing.
I just want to build on that because we also work closely with the mush sector. And one of the elements that is evolving a little bit is that cybersecurity attacks have basically made it mainstream in the last 18 months. So certainly 2 or 3 years ago, one of the challenges we were seeing is that those cybersecurity folks in hospitals and school boards who are jack of all trades had a really hard time not only getting to it, doing it off the corner of their desks, but also getting attention, prioritizing cybersecurity from the higher ups, getting the budgets that they needed, and so on. If you think about a hospital, if it's funding towards a new MRI machine or a cybersecurity system, these are the trade-offs that we often hear from our partners out in the real world having to make. But I think seeing large-scale cybersecurity incidents attack healthcare networks, attack universities, that has changed the discourse and has just put the spotlight a little bit on the importance of investments in this area.
I'll just pick up on that if I can too. I've spent much of my career as a counterterrorism investigator, and in counterterrorism we always viewed the issue as a threat to life. Cyber attacks against hospitals is now being viewed as a threat to life, right? Make no mistake, people died in Ireland because of the attacks on the healthcare sector in Ireland, and people died in Newfoundland because of the healthcare attacks in Newfoundland. So you're absolutely right, Tanya. Hospital administrator says, I've got $1 to spend. Do I spend it saving lives with an MRI, or do I spend it buying this, this software patch? Those are now both saving lives. And I think that the sectors, particularly the healthcare sector, has now woken up to that reality.
Well, let me push back a little bit. I agree with everything I'm hearing, but just for the benefit of the audience, what is it about the mush sector that makes that? Because it sounds like we're talking largely a financial pressure, sort of a lifeboat decision about what do I spend that money on. How is that different from what we see in a lot of corporations where You've got cyber coming out of the IT budget, and it's a choice between making the executives happy, keeping the workforce happy with new toys, dealing with those kinds of priorities as opposed to the cyber priority. What is it about the MUSH sector that makes it more vulnerable?
I think you can't really, put not enough weight on the financial aspect, Brent, in my opinion. It is the number one constraint that I hear, when I'm out in the field. It's about how do we make a dollar go further in the private sector. We have other mechanics at play. We can look at the measurement of, well, what is the liability of a cyber attack on our ability to drive our revenues? What can we reinvest in terms of our business? And we can even use it to position to help us win more business in the market by being the most secure. There's a lot of really strong business cases, I know, at least in the private sector, where cybersecurity, it becomes much easier to justify, I think. In the public sector, where we already have a lot of pressures, what I'm hearing over and over again is just it's hard to make the limited resources really spread them out, and it's getting pretty thin these days.
I think it's hard also for the MUSH sector to compete for cybersecurity resources, not just the technology, but the talent. Some of these organizations just can't compete with high-tech and private sector organizations from a salary perspective. And many of our MUSH sector organizations have access to some of our most important personal information, healthcare being one of them, or R&D, like in universities. So they're in that catch-22 of having highly sensitive information or access, and just not being able to access some of the talent and resources the same way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It is an issue of taking public dollars and spreading them around, and we see in Ontario right now you've got pressure on the education sector for increased wages from certain people. You've got pressure on the healthcare sector, which is overwhelmed, right? So there's only so many dollars to spend. They all have political masters, and that's the other thing, right? So, if the teachers go out on strike, Doug Ford's got to answer for that. Whether he's responsible for it or not, I'm not discussing that. But ultimately, there's a pressure from the political leaders to make these problems go away. So that's I don't doubt that that's the same for a CEO that's losing millions of dollars a day in lost revenue. But I know that the politicians are very alert to the fact that if something goes down on their watch, they're going to wear it.
So we're dealing with an environment of limited resources and also public accountability for how those resources get spent, and a public that maybe isn't as attuned to the need to spend on this as it should be. Let's talk about what a few years ago was starting to look like maybe a silver bullet on this. I know that a few years ago we were trying to push clients and organizations to get cyber insurance, and we started to see in courts and the privacy commissioners, it started working its way towards table stakes that a company would, among all the other things it should do, get cyber insurance. You alluded to this briefly before, Tanya, but it's a more complicated picture now on that front, I would say, than it was pre-COVID. Maybe I would put it to the group. What are your thoughts on that?
I can start. Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on, I love the topic of cyber insurance. First is that what we're hearing is the threshold for cyber insurance is just climbing over. It's getting higher and higher for the MUSH sector, but for all sectors, private and public. And so cybersecurity insurance is becoming more and more out of reach for many organizations. The second, though, is that most organizations that are struggling to have good security, good coverage, they do see their cybersecurity insurance as their safety net. This is well, if it happens to me, I won't be able to find room in my budget to rebuild my network. But my cybersecurity insurance will at least be there, and they'll have my back in a way. They'll be able to provide me with the resources to recover. So as our safety net becomes further out of reach for us, then the less safety nets that these institutions will have at the end of the day. And so we're kind of looking at a situation where the challenge is so high, but the level of support and safety nets are diminishing below their feet.
Agree, and I think, rather than it being a silver bullet, as you put it, it has to be a tool in a toolbox that companies need to have in place. So our response plan cybersecurity awareness training of employees, other technology measures. And in fact, we're starting to see that as a requirement. For example, many insurance companies are putting conditions on that cyber insurance of having some of these other preventative measures, some of these other systems and tools in place, because otherwise it's just a quick fix that's not sustainable.
I think it's important to make a distinction between cyber insurance and ransomware payment, right? I have no objection to insuring loss of a server farm or insuring damage to your brand or something like that. That's something that you probably would insure about. But you're absolutely right. The payout ratios for ransomware payments are untenable, and frankly, I don't think the insurance companies will be offering them very much longer because it's a fool's errand. More to the point, though, there's a bunch of things wrong with paying ransom now. To be clear, it's not illegal in Canada to pay ransom. It should be, in my humble opinion, because ultimately you're giving money to criminals, and these are the same criminals that are exploiting human trafficking, exploiting drugs. I don't think any CEO would want to go up on the Globe and Mail and say, look, my company is only viable if I use child labor. That's the only way I can keep this company afloat. And I don't think any company should say, this company is only viable if I pay ransom. I would actually encourage companies to make an anti-ransomware statement to be part of their ESG policy suite, saying, I will not ever do that. There are municipalities that do that, and they've suffered for it, but they are morally and ethically right. More to the point, though, if you pay ransomware, you're statistically more likely to get hit again because now you've identified yourself as an easy mark. And if you pay ransomware, there's absolutely no guarantee you're going to get the decryption keys. The decryption keys are going to work, or they're not going to resell the data on the dark web anyway, or there's all sorts of worms and nasties riddled through whatever's left of your network after you've paid the key. So I think the idea that, hey, I'm going to send 3 Bitcoin to this criminal organization and trust them to do the right thing, when you say it out loud, it doesn't even make sense.
That's why we don't say it out loud.
Sorry, was I not supposed to say that? Don't pay ransom.
If I can just maybe take a quick sidebar with you on that point, Sean, because I think it's an important one. One of the questions that I get asked as a data breach coach who is sometimes involved in the decision-making process for a company, are we going to pay the ransom or not? The question of illegality comes up, and it's a bit of a fine line, right? It's not a crime to pay, but it is a crime to finance terror. Maybe you can unpack that a bit for us, because this is an area that's complicated for us, because up to the minute, if a payment's going to be made, we have to be continually making sure that, to the best of the client's knowledge, they're not funding terrorism.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because, it's one thing to be on the wrong side of Conti or Revel. It's totally another thing to be on the wrong side of the U.S. government. And I would imagine they can actually put more pain and pressure on you than any of these groups can. So you're absolutely right. You could find inadvertently, it's a minefield out there between GDPR and the new Canadian legislation. We can talk about privacy later, but I just saw, yesterday Ireland levied a $276 million fine against Meta for breach of data. That's a lot of money. Ireland's up to $700 million in fines they've levied against Meta this year. So at a certain point, even for a big corporation like that, you got to start saying, am I doing the right thing here? So it is a difficult legislative environment, and it's just going to get muddier and muddier, which is kind of another reason why you probably don't want to go down that path.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to weigh in on counterterrorism or funding terror, or I assume we're all more or less against it, right?
I think against, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Can I get a show of hands? Everybody who's not for funding, that's good.
It's a fair point. Now, we've spent a fair amount of time defining and perhaps worrying a bit over what the threat looks like. Let's now move into more positive ground and start talking about exploring solutions. Chris, let me start with you on this. What advice do you give clients? Now, we're just talking now about sort of dealing with and preparing for. You touched on this a bit. What advice do you give clients in the MUSH sector who are facing these challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've got 2 points I just want to mention on it. So the first is, and I've said it at least 100 times, is that you have to start in a crawl, walk, run, or don't eat the elephant type of approach. Most of our technology leaders today are looking at, how do I protect everything? And these are large networks and very complex situations that they're in. and they're thinking, well, this task is just simply impossible. It's something we can't possibly achieve. And so that don't eat the elephant approach is really just taking a look at everything and all the different ways in which you're exposed and then prioritizing them. And then based on the resources that you do have that are available to you, starting to chisel away at those priorities one at a time. And so you won't be 100% secure. No one will be 100% secure ever, but you won't be out of the gate, but you will become a little bit more secure, and iteratively and over time, your organization is going to become more and more resilient. And the second advice that I give, and really it's advice I'm going to steal from the industry, is that more and more organizations, especially in the public sector, are starting to work in a highly collaborative way. They're forming working groups, they're having events like this, they're sharing best practices. I won't name any names, but we did have a number of local government organizations in Ontario that did go through ransomware attacks. They did not pay the ransomware, so it put them in situations where they had to rebuild everything from the ground up. And what we found was that all the different local government areas around them had lent people, had lent resources, and basically everyone chipped in. And so these working groups, these committees, these associations, like, they just really demonstrate that in the face of these challenges, there is a lot of optimism, there's a lot of strength in us working together as a collective, both in the public and the private and together, to solve these problems. So I'm seeing a lot of really optimistic things happening as a community.
I just want to pick up on that multi-stakeholder piece, because one of the things we have found is that this is a complex problem and everyone owns part of those solutions, from individual Canadians who need to educate themselves and protect themselves, as you were talking about what are the steps you can take to not become victim of crime. Organizations need to upskill and up their game. And then there's, of course, a role for governments at various levels. So, at the federal level, for example, the government has just wrapped up its consultation process on the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And certainly, one of the things called for and a role that the government can play is looking at this multi-stakeholder environment and improving that coordination within itself, because there's various departments that do touch on cybersecurity and that historically haven't acted in lockstep, if we will. I think there is a renewed sense of urgency. We've been talking about how this is, a little more of a topic that's entered top of mind and that renewed sense of urgency in terms of the impact that it's having. There's probably a role. We've talked about the MUSH sector a lot, so there is a role for government certainly to make sure that they are supporting the MUSH sector and other small, medium organizations where there might be where that lack of resources is really affecting their ability to protect themselves. So just a few ways, I think, certainly at the federal government level, but with that multi-stakeholder area, it looks like.
Yeah, I totally agree with my colleagues here. We're not helpless here. There are tools, and there is even free tools out there. 40% of security compromises happen because people are using out of the box, right? So you can do basic things like patch maintenance and changing out of the box security maintenance, which doesn't really cost you anything. Any CISO should be able to do that, even in a small organization. There are services like the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity offers a lot of advice and guides for people. They offer tools that can help small, medium enterprises to harden themselves a little bit. Now again, I go back to say, if you've got the Chinese government really wants in your computer, they're going to get in. You're going to have to take an additional layer of security to protect your data. But if you're a MUSH sector, if you're an SME, you can harden yourself. There are other organizations, private organizations, that are offering, network monitoring services and stuff like that. They are affordable, right? And that's where companies need to start saying, well, hey, cyber insurance is going to cost me this much money. Maybe those dollars are better spent on cyber resiliency and cyber defense. Right? And I'm not trying to take anything away from the insurance sector, but everybody's got a finite number of dollars to spend. And we don't just spend money on fire insurance. We buy smoke detectors, we buy fire extinguishers. We don't keep piles of oily rags by the stove. We take steps ourselves, and insurance is not the only thing that's going to save our house.
Just want to pick up on that fire analogy, because one of the things we talked about is, and you just touched on it, if someone wants in, they might get in, and part of that resiliency is then what's your plan for if you do, right? we are all supposed to have that evacuation plan at home, and when there's a fire, which exits are you going to take? And so that is the same with a cyber incident. If or when your organization gets hit, how will you respond? Tabletop exercise is a fulsome plan. I know you talked about that yesterday when we talked about this.
Yeah, there are so many different exercises and ways to prepare the organization, to train the organization. One of my favorites, and I'll give kudos to my CISO, Sean, is that when we get together for our annual corporate conference, he doesn't just do cybersecurity training of all these staff, teaching us, well, don't put that USB stick you just found into your laptop, right? But he actually this year went out of his way to put USB sticks strategically throughout the event. And then, the employees that plugged them in, sure enough, he had their laptops and their metadata, and he put them all up on the screen and said, hey, look, we have, 4 of you today plugged in these USB sticks, shame on you. So you can get creative with it, but I think the big takeaway there is that training, because a lot of the vulnerabilities are actually vulnerabilities through phishing, social engineering. It's we, the people, right? We're vulnerable, and we let the intruders into our organizations. And then Tanya just mentioned the tabletop exercise. We do these about twice a year. It's my favorite exercise, and we do them with clients as well. They're simulations. You kind of sit down and you basically say, okay, we're going to simulate a DDoS attack that is going to take off this, business critical network of ours, or we're going to simulate a data breach and a loss of, client or citizen data. Now go. And you don't tell all your employees, you don't tell all your staff, you tell key actors, that are involved in the simulation, just go with it and let's see what happens. But those simulations are really effective at seeing where we have weaknesses in our process, our communication plans, in terms of how it is that we're going to respond to this in an appropriate and in a timely way. So there are a lot of exercises that we can do as organizations, make us more resilient. And these are not necessarily even high-cost exercises. These are things that are, done internally, training within the company itself.
I just want to add that the employee data you just heard about for those 4 compromised employees is available for a reasonable price on the dark web. And we'll have a coupon code for those of you that are watching the live broadcast. We touched on a few. I want to come back to the collaboration issue and the roles of the different sort of stakeholders here, because that's a big question. But before we get there, maybe we can just spend a little more. We've started to do this. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the specific pieces of what goes into resilience, what goes into that planning. Tanya, you mentioned something that is what we would normally what we would call an incident response plan, but there's incident response plans and there's incident response plans. I had a client call up a few months ago with a data breach, and I said, well, let's go through the checklist. Do you have an incident response plan? Yeah, we phone you. You done anything else?
Not bad.
No, we call you, and that's it. We had at the beginning of COVID incident response plans that had been written because companies knew they were supposed to have them, and it's a playbook. We'll get into this. And then they put them in a drawer because having created one, they had met their compliance obligations, and then they put it in a drawer. And then COVID happened, there's a breach, they take out the incident response plan. The first thing it says is get everyone together in a room. We can't do that, everyone's remote deployed, and half of these people aren't at the company anymore. So there's right ways and wrong ways to do this. So maybe we can go around the horn and talk a bit about what goes into proper resilience planning for a mush sector organization, or any organization for that matter.
I'll start with the optimistic note. I think that the imperative for cybersecurity, cyber defense, cyber resiliency has now caught the attention of the executive suites in most Canadian corporations. If it hasn't, then we're almost reaching that point of willful negligence, where it's like, how are you not paying attention to this? And as a result of that, some of the things Chris was talking about, the imperative to actually do cyber resiliency training, tabletop exercises, building your response plan, things like that are definitely things to happen. Canada has an amazing tech sector, right? That we're blessed in that sense, right? The tech hub in Kitchener-Waterloo is second to none, maybe second to Silicon Valley, but even there, it's running as a world leader. And there are technologies out there that as a CEO or a CISO, I would be looking at, and whether that's creating physical or logical air gaps for my data backup, and there are companies that will sell that solution, or database encryption. So the data is encrypted at the point of creation, and fine, steal it. You won't be able to read it. You won't be able to see anything. It's useless to you. And again, Canadian companies are global leaders in that, where they're getting called by Americans and Europeans and that. But it's important, and I think that ultimately it's the legislative environment that's really captured that. Part of it's the media, but if you look at some of the legislation coming down the pipe, C-26 federal legislation, or we were talking about C-64 in Quebec, there's significant financial penalties both for corporations and for executive officers for getting this wrong. So, you can no longer, to continue this analogy, I'm going to steal your evacuation plan extension. I don't think a company would want to be in a position where they didn't have a fire evacuation plan. I think that they would find themselves in a load of legal liability. We've reached that point with cyber now. Maybe another year for everybody to catch up and read the memo, but we're there now.
And with that plan, I can't help but stress the practice that plan. In our offices, we have fire drills where, we put on the hats and we evacuate the buildings and we wait outside till everything is clear. We need to practice our cybersecurity plans, our incident response plans. And second, we need to really pay attention, and I talk to a lot of clients about this, about that communication element as well. In the public sector, we're stewards of our citizens' data. They trust us, and I don't know if we'll really get into trust and the topic of trust today too far, but because we're trusted institutions, the way that we respond to these incidents will determine how our citizens are going to trust us in the future. And so to preserve that trust, over the years and over time, we need to be able to make sure that we're communicating properly, that we're communicating effectively, and that ultimately, we're practicing these incident response plans and that we're prepared.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Sean and Chris have said, and I think it ties back to your question earlier when you asked, what's so particular about the MUSH sector? The bar is just higher.
Well, that's a fair point. Let me come back to one of the issues that I think all three of you touched on a bit is need for collaboration. We talked about, we're starting to see some of it. So I've titled this little section, Aligning the Players. So we've got the private sector, you've got the government in the sense of government at the top level, federal government and so forth. You've got these organizations who are, I guess to some extent, stuck in the middle, the MUSH organizations where they're not in charge of cyber, they don't have the budget that the federal government has to fight it, but they're quasi-governmental or government-aligned sectors. So whose job is what in this picture? Who's responsible? Who do we think should be responsible for what? How do we tie it all together? So I appreciate that's a large and, pardon the pun, mushy question, but let's see where we go with it.
Who's responsible for raising a child? It takes a village to raise a child. I've been saying now for several months, there is an us and a them. The them is Russia and China, and the us is Canada, and it's Canadian government and Canadian public sector and private sector working together in partnerships. Again, go back, not to belabor the fire analogy, but we don't look at the fire department as the sole securer of our fire safety. We have a role to play in that as well. So the government works quite closely, and I'm very happy to say, the four main cyber actors in the government of Canada, the ecosystem is ourselves, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, and the RCMP. And we will do these panels like this, the three of us, all the time, back and forth across the country. I was down in Toronto last week, talking to 50, 60 organizations saying, hi, I'm CSIS, this is what I do, this is my partner from the RCMP, this is what she will do, and this is my partner from the Cyber Center, this is what he will do. So this is what your federal government's gonna do. Now, part of that presentation, we had provincial, we had Toronto Police, New York Police, right? So it takes a lot of people working together, but it also takes that public-private partnership to work together. I work with a lot of industries, and I'm amazed and I won't name a particular industry, but competitors that will get into a knife fight over a customer or market share, when they're under a cyber attack, will band together to fight off that common enemy. And I'm very impressed, and as a Canadian, proud to see sectors cooperating like that.
Before we move down the line, I should just point out that one good example of that is the Canadian, which I think not enough people know about. I mean, people in the security sector know, and the big organizations do, but we do have the Canadian Center, the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, where, just as you said, those competitors, like the financial institutions that are fighting for market share against each other, the telecoms who are fighting against each other for customers and all of that, they share threat data. They talk very regularly about defending these things, and they're sharing threat intelligence.
And just, I'll let my colleagues speak, but part of that is because they're all connected on the back end, right? So a chain's as weak as its weakest link. And if somebody gets in underneath the wire, let's pick the teleco, say there's a small telco operator in a not central Canadian province that gets got, well, all of a sudden they're now on the national backbone. So everybody's got a problem.
Sure, I think Sean,
No, please go
I
ahead.
think Sean did a good job, and I think, the government has that, gosh, we're really belaboring this fire analogy, but,
Yeah, that's right.
they run the fire department, but each of us as individuals have a number of steps and precautions that we have to take, and I think that is a critical role, whether it's individuals or organizations, and I think that is where certainly organizations like us at CIRA have the opportunity and a role to play in helping educate Canadians and organizations in terms of what, and collaborating with the government on what the threat landscape, like what's the lay of the land, what is actually going on, and what can you do about it. We have the benefit at CIRA, we provide free tools, like Canadian Shield, to Canadians to help protect themselves and other services to the MUSH sector. But I do think there is a combination of having the right infrastructure in place, the right public infrastructure in place, but also that personal responsibility.
And I can't really add much more to this kind of answer, but the one thing I will say is I do see an opportunity for more communication between the layers of government and between the public and the private sector, especially in the realm of cybersecurity. There doesn't go by a single week where I don't learn about a federal program that could benefit my clients or benefit us within our organization that I didn't even know existed, but had been publicly released 4 or 5 months ago. Even as we prepared for this panel, I learned about programs that existed that I didn't know existed. And I actually consider myself somewhat informed in the subject. And so there is a ton out there in terms of resources. Everyone does step up. I truly believe every level of government, every organization is stepping up. But I think we could all do a better job. Keep having events like this, keep sharing the programs that are available with each other and the best practices. And the more we do this, then I do believe the more resilient and stronger we become as a country and a community.
Unabashed plug, I feel remiss for not mentioning this, but yeah, Canadian Shield is an outstanding tool, and I get no remuneration for saying that.
Can I get well, you've got the mic. Why don't you explain what that is a little bit, first for anyone who's watching the broadcast that hasn't heard of this? I should say we have an international audience, so here's your chance to make the other countries jealous.
I guess I'll jump in since it is a CIRA service. So Canadian Shield is a protected DNS service that CIRA put together for Canadians. It uses threat feeds from a number of sources, including CCCS, which is one of the core threat feeds in there. Canadians can install it in a number of ways, from changing your router settings to installing the app on your phone. So it caters to different levels of technology. And really what it is to do at its fundamental is it offers a privacy service. But really the true value of the service is that at 2 of its levels, it offers malware blocking. So blocking botnets, ransomware, malicious phishing links, and so on. And so it really is meant to be a way that we can give back to the community and help enable that trusted internet for Canadians, help protect Canadians online as part of how we give back.
Great. I want to pick up on one thing. We're going to save some time for questions at the end of this, but something that you'd raised, Sean, there's an intersection of privacy and cybersecurity. There's, I think, sometimes a tendency to think of privacy as separate from cybersecurity, but I think that distinction is becoming more and more artificial, especially with the new legislation we have either coming down the pipe or already in place. And just to get into what you mentioned Quebec's Bill 64, which, as you said, has substantial fines for organizations and individuals. There's also a private right of action, so you can sue for a breach of the statute, which is not something that we have had in a lot of Canadian privacy laws before. And it doesn't say this explicitly, but it's extraterritorial in reach, like the GDPR. So if you are operating in out of some other country, but your activities affect Quebecois, you're subject to this law. PIPEDA is much the same, actually. It's not explicit on the point, but we have commissioners' rulings that say that that's how it works. We have Bill C-27, which has just gone to second reading, and the legislature is going to be going to committee, and it's going to replace PIPEDA. It's going to bring in substantial monetary penalties, and again, a private right to sue under the statute. And we've got Bill C-26, which imposes specific cybersecurity obligations on critical infrastructure, and again, there's monetary penalties, there's criminal sanctions for those that don't do what they need to do under these bills. But the privacy laws, that's a cyber bill specifically, the privacy laws we just talked about, all of them have built into them the concept, it's not expressed technically, that you have to be taking reasonable steps to secure the data that you're taking care of, and that's obviously cybersecurity. So we'll go around the horn on this again. How well prepared do we think MUSH sector organizations are to meet these obligations? Maybe I'll start with you, Chris, because you're working with them directly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and there aren't many conversations today that are about cybersecurity that also don't include that data privacy aspect of it. The privacy aspect, what we're really talking about is, we're stewards of our citizens or our customers' data, and how do we use that data responsibly and in a way that, if we are going to be stewards, that they can trust us with that data. And so on and so on. And these regulations are becoming more broad and more complex, and we see regulations in Europe like GDPR, and then in California with CCPA. But now, as you mentioned, Brent, a lot of new regulations coming out of Quebec and introduced across Canada as well soon. And so the question, how ready are our local governments, our MUSH sector for these data privacy changes in these regulations? So we did Portage sponsored market research with IDC just earlier this year, and we released it about 2 weeks ago. And in that market research, we spoke to 500 CIOs, public sector CIOs across Canada, and we asked them, what are your top challenges or top 5 challenges when it comes to implementing new innovation or delivering services more efficiently to your citizens? And in that list of all of the challenges that came up, one of the highest ranking challenges was the complex data privacy regulations and ecosystems. They're seeing this as another situation where, as organizations, they don't feel prepared to address the changes in regulations. The regulations, in their defense, are shifting quite rapidly, and they are evolving rapidly as technology also is evolving rapidly as well. And so what's happening is that this MUSH sector is actually taking a step back from things like digital IDs and digital services until they can get a better grasp on how to handle data privacy regulations. So it is impacting them in a lot of ways, and not many are feeling overly prepared to address the challenges.
I think the other thing is that some of the expectations with some of these pieces of legislation are still a little bit nebulous. C27 is a good example. There will be some requirements for having cybersecurity measures in place, but those haven't been spelled out and defined. So what will be sufficient is still sort of a black box. And so how prepared is the MUSH sector? We don't know, because there's really not a good understanding of how prepared is prepared enough.
On that last bit, yes, this is going to be one of these, it's the tension we always have with legislation governing a technical field, where as soon as if you make it technical, it's obsolete as soon as it's passed, and so you have broad concepts that are then left to be duked out in the courts and in front of the privacy commissioners, which, as a lawyer, I think is exactly the way it should be.
Just on a broader, sorry, Sean, before you jump in, but just on a broader nature, I think, if the results from our survey I talked about earlier, and I said like half of respondents hadn't even advised their senior executives, let alone their customers, about breaches, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of organizations out there that are just not mentally prepared for these kinds of requirements, forget all of the technical requirements, and so that there is a gap to fill there on just the behaviors that are that these pieces of legislation are trying to inculcate in people.
The private sector is profit-driven. It should be. That's okay, and we're allowed to do that, right? So I have confidence that the large Canadian corporations are going to wrap their heads around this pretty quickly, and they're going to realize that there's a financial jeopardy to getting this wrong. I think for the smaller and medium enterprises, it's a higher lift for them to make, and we collectively need to help them come to those understandings, understand what the correct legally and ethical course of action to take is. And as for government, I think the MUSH sector is probably a little bit behind. But, CEOs of corporations and high-level government employees, they make good money. And at the end of the day, it's like that money comes with responsibility. And part of your responsibility is to get this right. And if you can't get that right, then you're probably not in the right job. And if you were a CEO and you got it wrong, you'd probably be kicking your lunchbox down the hallway. And the same thing in government, right? So I don't think we need to be afraid of it. We need to be mature. We need to realize, okay, this is a thing, just like all the other things that we've had to adapt to over the last 200 years. The solution of it is if one doesn't want to do it, it's fine. Unplug from the internet. You're safe. Not sure how you're going to make money, but you're safe.
I can't think of a better way to end the formal part of this discussion with that and the survey of 200 years of our history all in one comment. So I'm going to end the formal program there. We have a microphone here that's available for any folks that want to ask any questions, or if you've brought a laptop that needs repair, I'm sure someone up here can help you, not me.
Probably me.
I am conscious of the fact, for the benefit of the folks watching on live stream, that we are standing in the way of an audience and lunch. But we'll do what we can.
Can you make a link to the previous session on blockchain? But is there any implication for blockchain for cybersecurity, or can blockchains be used to make your private output or mesh outfit make your operations more secure?
Oh, yeah.
I'll jump in with one observation.
Well played. You hold this.
Yeah.
As a data breach coach, I'll jump in and just sort of point out, like, there are real security advantages to blockchain technology, but it is not unhackable, and it also interacts with other kinds of backends and other kind of, like, it also intersects with other technologies. And if it's not a black box that's completely separate, it's vulnerable to attack. And I, in my own practice, have seen successful attacks that work their way through blockchain. So we can't treat it, it's not going to be a panacea. It certainly is, it does have some advantages, but I'll turn it over to the experts.
I love blockchain. I can talk about this for about an hour, but I'll try to keep it to a minute. We have a research and development lab right now that's experimenting with verifiable credentials in blockchain, because we're trying to solve the problem around cyber fraud and enabling digital services online. A lot of the services that our clients want to deliver online require proof of who the individual is at the other side with a high degree of certainty or assurance. And so verifiable credentials, ultimately for us, we believe that's the solution. And blockchain seems to be one of the leading, if not the leading technologies around the verifiable credential capabilities and what we're trying to do. So we're looking at blockchain to enable verifiable credentials, which hopefully will reduce cyber fraud and enable more digital services online. Yeah.
I think, just to Brent's point, there's no panacea. There's a toolbox. You want to use all the tools that are available to you, and certain tools are cheaper, certain tools are easier. So the size of your enterprise is going to largely dictate the ability of the tool that you adopt, or the tool set that you adopt. And if you're a mom and pop shop, maybe the best you can do is download and install Canadian Shield, and that's okay. You've taken a concrete step. And if you're a Big Five bank, then you're probably using many, many layers. Security is an onion. There's layers and layers and layers of security. And people get in trouble when they think there's just one bulletproof solution.
Anyone else? I see a hand up back there.
Hossein Badran from the Internet Society. I had a question regarding an important point, maybe not as attractive as blockchains, but encryption was mentioned as a pillar in the conversation. And the insights believe encryption to be a key ingredient for secure and trustworthy communication. What would you see the right path to take, given that some of the legislative frameworks that are being proposed, you mentioned, for example, online harms or online safety, would look at private communication and perhaps make it mandatory to have some backdoors in order to suspect and monitor the traffic that is being communicated. What kind of actions do you see, or what kind of advice can we provide to policymakers to make the communication more secure and trustworthy?
That's an interesting question, because there's a tension between security providers and governments, that governments tend to want backdoors to be able to see, the data, because nobody wants to see somebody, encrypt, malicious stuff, child pornography or something like that, and then the government can't see it to stop it, right? So there's definitely a tension there. We live in a liberal democracy, so the freedoms tend to scale towards the individuals and the privacy of the individuals. That would not be the case in the PRC or in Russia, where there definitely are going to be backdoors by law riddled into the technology, and you're seeing now, Iran being a perfect case where if you want to sell computers in Iran, you have to install their backdoor into it, and if you don't, then you can't sell computers there, at least not on the open market. So We're liberal democracies. We should, find that space, and it's above my pay grade to find that space.
I don't have a whole lot more to add, but I will say that privacy and encryption is part of it, but privacy of even things like your DNS data. So privacy from government intervention is one part of it, but also from commercialization. And so it's one of the reasons we built it into Canadian Shield as one of the layers is privacy, DNS privacy as well.
I think it's fair to say that if we're going to have backdoors, we're going to also, the companies and citizens groups will demand that there's real oversight over when government can use that data, because there's always the concern of sort of, it's not mission creep, but it's something like that in terms of tendency, and we saw this in the States with the NSA, a tendency to want all the data. Understandably, from a security perspective, you have greater options and greater oversight, if you have greater insight, if you can see more. I saw a hand over here.
I'd just like to know your views on where does cloud computing fit into cybersecurity, and particularly the MUSH sector, where you have all these, in the case of hospitals, very multi-layered kind of institutions and universities, in terms of where does it fit as a solution, where does it fit as a challenge?
So, in my experience, many of these organizations are still looking to the cloud as a solution for scalability and efficiency, and I'm still seeing a large migration of the applications and the data into the large public cloud offerings that are available on the market today. With that said, there's that caveat though, because it's a cybersecurity talk, and so now we're extending our networks into a network that we don't own. And so we need to approach with caution, and we need to start treating it as though it is a network that we do own, not just something that we're renting with, in the cloud provider. So you have to approach, and our recommendation is you got to approach with caution. A lot of cloud security assessments, you got to do the proper testing and pen testing and the rest. Like, there's a lot of due diligence, in my opinion, when moving from your own on-premise network, where maybe where, how everything is running, into a cloud environment that's run by someone else. And so I guess, without getting into too much detail, there's just a lot of considerations that need to be taken before making that migration to the cloud. But I do see that more and more often, organizations still see the business case to do so compared to building their own data centers, running their own on-premise infrastructure. Or in some cases, healthcare in particular, I'm seeing a lot more of the hybrid model, where some of the business critical and the citizen data, or the health data and things are living on-prem, where they have closer control and they can keep a closer watch. And they're using the public cloud for non-confidential data in areas where the security threshold and expectations is not so high.
I'll just add, there's the cloud is in AWS or Azure or some of those services, but there's also sort of this software as a service and other providers who may host, understanding what data organizations are putting with which providers, what the requirements are, what those providers are able to do with whatever data you put in there. And so just being more and more conscious of that. Certainly small and medium enterprise, our experiences, we're seeing that people are not fully understanding the cloud is this nebulous thing that some people think lives out there, but it actually lives somewhere physical. And so helping make sure that organizations understand what they're putting with whom and where.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, and it breaks my heart because we could talk about this all day, but someday we probably will.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Brent and Sean, Tanya, and Chris. Sean, I wasn't as terrified as I usually am after one. I got a little disappointed.
Sorry, we could talk about the pending nuclear war in Europe.
Good on that note, we have a lovely lunch from La Bottega. I ask you to help yourself. And I've allocated an hour and a half for lunch, so we'll meet back at 1 for the rest of the program.
And the interrogations will happen after lunch.
You do a great job.